The stories we tell ourselves matter. As I've explained many times throughout these videos, I understand religious teachings, religious scriptures, in a mythological sense. They're creative, almost artistic, and often emotional ways of understanding what it means to be human, how human beings are related to the rest of the world, how we come to be who we are, both individually and as a species, and so on. The kind of big questions that we always ask. The mythologies that answer these questions for us are stories that we use to uplift ourselves, to explain ourselves, sometimes to admonish ourselves, sometimes to entertain ourselves, and sometimes to sustain ourselves. Often we don't really identify these stories as myths. We think they're real, we think they're historical, and we think they're factual. When we come to realize that they're not, in fact, those things, if indeed we ever do realize this, we may decide that they're worthless. Or we may decide that they're still helpful as stories. We can read fables, fairy tales, even longer works of fiction without thinking that they're factual, and they can still teach us. They can still uplift us, and they can still show us how to behave in the world. All those things. So we don't have to just toss them out just because they're not literally true. But it does matter what those myths are telling us about ourselves and about the world. These stories are not morally neutral, and some of them, frankly, aren't helpful. For example, stories of hellfire are not helpful, unless you think that the only way that people can be good or can worship God is if they're threatened with eternal punishment if they're not good or if they don't worship God. That story might originate as a way of forcing people to do the right thing, but it's not a good or healthy way to do that. First of all, you can't force people to be good. And if you do succeed by these means in forcing people to do what you think they should do, of what moral value is such forced obedience? None at all, I would say. A myth which depicts God as a cruel and vindictive being that I know, some people would say that this shows that he is a just God, but that's precisely my point. If you have this myth of what justice is like, that becomes the model for justice in our world. This is not a helpful, constructive myth. Similarly, if you have a view that the world is ruled by the devil and his hordes of demons, that this is a place of temptation and depravity, or if perhaps you think this world is just a training ground for a better world to come, if either or both of these are your guiding mythology, or part of it anyway, then this is not conducive to addressing problems in this world, to trying to fix this world. This world is not ultimately important, according to this mythology. Now, you might be someone who accepts this mythology, but nevertheless seeks to do good in the world, to improve the world. But if you do this, you're not being motivated by this mythology. Your motivation comes from elsewhere and is somewhat in conflict with this mythology, I would suggest. Perhaps there's another myth within your tradition that you prefer. Maybe it's that of a loving, caring, forgiving God. Good, that's great. That mythology will result in a much more caring, much more positive attitude towards the world and towards other people. That's great, but I suggest you can do without carrying this other myth like a millstone around your neck. Our myths matter. Our stories matter. I've seen atheists try to answer the question, perhaps posed to them by others, or perhaps they're just posing it to themselves. What would make you or enable you to return to God? I guess there are two parts to this question, really. The first is a question of fact. Does God exist? What would convince you of that? The second part is often not overtly stated. What would lead you back to worshipping God? Perhaps those who ask the first question think that once you know God exists, obviously you're going to worship him. But that isn't the case. It would depend very much on what this God was like. It would depend upon the mythology in which he is shrouded. I'm actually less concerned with the question of whether or not God exists than I am with the question of what is this mythology. I think the mythology itself is very important. To be honest, I think it's more important than the mere factual question of whether or not God exists, or indeed whether these stories are actually true. I don't much care whether they're true in the literal, factual, historical sense. I care about what values and behaviour they evoke in us. I care about what lessons they have about how we behave in the world, how we behave towards each other. I care about whether they bring joy, hope, creativity, and love into the world, as opposed to sorrow, despair, destruction, and hate. There are a whole range of mythologies to choose from. I actually quite like some of the Wiccan mythology. Not all of it, but some of it. I like, for example, that Wiccans see the divine in terms of a duality, masculine and feminine. Both are aspects of the divine, something which is clearly lacking in the dominant Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions. Although the feminine does try to creep in here and there in those predominantly masculine mythologies. Maybe as far as Wicca's concerned, maybe a third non-binary option would be even more helpful. Look, I don't believe there actually is such a being or such beings, but the story is one that I like. It brings balance into the world. I also quite like the neo-pagan image of the triple goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crone. It represents the divine in a way that honours the feminine, honours motherhood, and honours old age. I like the Wiccan reverence for nature. It considers the earth and its cycles as sacred. It sees all things as connected, and its rituals reflect this. This promotes a respectful, positive attitude towards the world. I'm not a Wiccan or a neo-pagan, and probably never will be. I don't believe literally in these things. But the aspects I've pointed out are positive, creative, and I like them as stories. I think overall it's a good mythology to have floating around in our culture. I honestly can't see myself ever believing in God again. And even if I did, worshipping him would be another matter altogether. What I would like to see are better stories, a more positive, creative, uplifting, life-affirming mythology. Some would argue that the Christian story is just that, but I don't see it. Certainly not in the noisiest versions of Christianity in the world anyway. I don't like many of the values and much of the behaviour that seems to flow from this mythology. I know there are exceptions, but I'm inclined to think they're driven by other strands within this mythology. If you can isolate these positive elements from the other crap, well, that's great. Please do so. I remember at one stage during my Christian life being drawn to a particular branch of Christian spirituality called creation spirituality, spearheaded by a former Dominican priest by the name of Matthew Fox. I know that he actually worked quite closely with the Wiccan movement at times in developing his ideas and his teachings. The Dominican order didn't much like what he was doing and expelled him from the order, and eventually he joined the Episcopalian Church. Now this was a very creation-centered spirituality, not in the sense of creationism, but more in the Wiccan sense of valuing creation, of respecting creation, of seeing creation as itself sacred in some way. It was a very eco-friendly type of spirituality. I do recall at one stage that there were concerns expressed about Fox's use of a private jet, how this didn't seem to fit in with the values he was preaching. And we've seen evangelical pastors criticised over this kind of thing too. As a result of this, I do remember becoming somewhat disillusioned with him at least, if not with the kind of spirituality that he was teaching. I may talk about this particular movement in more detail in another video because it illustrates very well the importance of the kinds of mythological stories that we're telling ourselves that are guiding our culture and our society, and that it may even be possible to draw such stories from within the Christian tradition, though not, I'm sure, without considerable opposition.